Thank you to the committee for the opportunity to be a part of this conference, and especially to be able to lead off this section on mental health. My name is Peter Ballerstedt, and I'll be the moderator for this opening segment. Most people recognize that there is an epidemic of chronic illness in the United States today. In fact, it's a global epidemic, with chronic illnesses being the leading cause of death globally. This is an unsustainable burden upon our healthcare systems, not to mention their unsustainable economic, societal, and environmental impacts. What many do not recognize is that there is a common root cause. This common root is insulin resistance with chronically elevated insulin, technically hyperinsulinemia. Greater knowledge of this and adoption of proven lifestyle interventions can reverse the decades-long increase in metabolic illnesses, regenerating public health in this country and around the world. Today, we'll hear from a researcher and a medical practitioner who are striving to increase our awareness and understanding of this greatest threat to our public health. The researcher, Professor Benjamin Bickman from BYU, will present a short introduction to insulin resistance as the key to metabolic health, and the physician, Dr. Brian Lenskis, will speak on the clinical applications of metabolic health.
Hello, and thank you for allowing me a few minutes to share with you some of my research. I am Professor Ben Bickman. I'm a biomedical scientist and professor in the cell biology department at Brigham Young University. My research is focused on metabolic health, and it is a problem, no surprise to any of us, where a recent report indicated that roughly 88% of U.S. adults were considered metabolically unhealthy. In other words, only 12% were considered in good health. And to varying degrees, this is a problem that is reflected around the world through Southeast Asia, the Middle East, East Asia, and throughout the Pacific. Even in our own backyard, for example, Mexico has a bigger metabolic problem than we do. Now, I'm mentioning metabolic health, and I appreciate the fact that there may be myriad ways of defining it. One way to define it would be to see it through the lens of the metabolic syndrome. The metabolic syndrome is this cluster of metabolic complications that always tend to go together. Things like too much fat around the waist, high glucose levels in the blood, high blood pressure, and collectively we could say dyslipidemia, where triglycerides are too high and or HDL is too low. Now, these seem like they are related but different in origin, and yet in reality, they all share one thing in common, namely insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is the most common health disorder worldwide, indeed reflected throughout the world in the map I just showed you. But insulin resistance is also very relevant, even beyond its prevalence, insofar as it is a leading contributor to some of the most costly and crushing chronic diseases like diabetes and certain cancers and heart disease, as well as less lethal but no less unfortunate problems like infertility and problems of the mind. Now, what is insulin resistance? It's a twofold problem. Namely, some cells aren't responding very well to the hormone insulin, but then also insulin levels are higher. These two things always go together. Now that you know what it is, where does it come from? As an insulin-resistant studying scientist, I say that there are three primary causes: stress and the related hormones like cortisol and epinephrine, inflammation from any cause, infection or food sensitivities or hypersensitivities, and then lastly, hyperinsulinemia, the technical term for too much insulin in the blood. Of these three, all of which are capable of causing insulin resistance, one stands supreme, namely elevated insulin. When there is too much insulin, the body becomes insulin resistant, and that's reflected here. So chronically elevated insulin will result in a reduction to insulin sensitivity. It's almost as if the cells of the body are becoming deaf. And then as we transition to the latter half of this talk, If too much insulin is the key contributor, then it's no surprise that reducing insulin is the key solution. Now, as a brief tangent, I wanted to take a moment to make you familiar with what the various macronutrients, fats, proteins, carbs do to insulin. You can see here, and this is a reproduction of a human study, dietary fat alone has no effect. Dietary protein may have a modest effect, if any. And then dietary carbohydrate, at least in a pure form like glucose, of course, has a substantial effect on insulin. This is important not only because of the direct effect of the carbohydrate, but even more so when we look at what the global dietary trends are. Namely, that over 70% of all calories consumed globally come from carbohydrates. And increasingly, this is from refined starches and sugars, as I like to say, that come from bags and boxes with barcodes. So, knowing all of this, when we look at adopting a dietary solution that helps insulin come down, there are really three main pillars based on the three main macronutrients. And they are, in what I think is in fact the particular order, control carbs, prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. Now, with regards to control carbs, perhaps the simplest way to look at this is if a person is eating carbs, they need to be focusing on fiber. Where there is more fiber in a carbohydrate, that is going to result in a lower glucose load in the blood, which will in turn result in a lower insulin level, thereby helping resolve insulin resistance. Of course, the more a person eats carbs, the more important fiber is. Thus, in contrast, the lower carb consumption is, the less important fiber is. Now, with regards to prioritizing protein, any animal source protein is going to be superior to any plant source protein. And importantly, the older we get, the more protein we need, ideally from animal sources, because plant proteins are known to contain anti-nutrients that literally block the absorption of the proteins and other minerals, as well as potentially being loaded with heavy metals like lead and arsenic. But with regards to age, the older we get, the more protein we need to eat. That the older people are who eat less protein, the higher their mortality. And I'm going to share with you a study in just a second on this. And then the third point, don't fear fat. These are the natural fats, or the fats that we have been eating as humans since time immemorial. This is fats from animal sources. Any are I would consider healthy, and fruit fats. So coconuts, avocados, olives. You'll notice that what I don't have on here is the so-called vegetable oils. There's nothing vegetable about them. They are they're refined oils from seeds, like soybean oil, most especially. Now, you'll notice here that I've kept the prioritized protein pillar here as well. That's because in nature, all protein comes with fat. In our fear of fat, and I would add our hubris and ignorance of human physiology, we've tended to strip away the fat and only focus on the protein. But again, there is no natural source of protein without fat. It doesn't happen. I think there's a lesson we could learn there if we're humble enough to hear it. And part of this is reflected in the fact that when humans eat protein with fat, we digest that protein better because of the facilitative actions of bile. And it's also more anabolic. That in human studies that exercise humans and give them a protein load, they can increase the muscle protein synthesis from that protein load by adding fat to it. And as I alluded to a moment ago, there is growing evidence, and I would say this is probably a result of scientists being a little more courageous in sharing data that is inconvenient. But here was a paper published documenting that the more persons eating animal protein, the more likely they are to live. And some may say, well, what about all that dreaded saturated fat? Even that story is starting to fall by the wayside, where we have institutions, including this one from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, noting, and I've underlined here, that foods that are enriched with saturated fats are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. In fact, that is a long, remarkable history in looking at the faulty evidence and the efforts in previous decades to literally hide evidence and prevent it from being published because it was considered too problematic with the prevailing paradigm with regards to vilifying saturated fats. Okay, in the time we've had together, we've gone through some very important points. I hope you consider them important, namely making sure that you're familiar with what insulin resistance is and its contribution, even though we didn't have time to talk about mechanism, to all of these so-called plagues of prosperity. We also discussed where insulin resistance comes from, with a heavy emphasis on elevated insulin itself being the key contributor. And then finally, we spent the last several minutes talking about the solution, because as much as this seems like a bit of a horror story, it is at least one with a happy ending, namely that if we can change the way we eat, what was perhaps initially the culprit becomes the cure. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this information helpful. And again, I'm delighted to have been able to participate.
Hello, my name is Brian Lenskis. I'm an internal medicine doctor. Honored to be with you today. Honored to speak with two of my fellow colleagues here, Dr. Bickman and Dr. Ballerstedt. Let's jump right into the talk. My plans to build upon the foundation laid by Dr. Bickman. He has all the science down, and I'm applying his science to clinical practice. Here's my talk: clinical application of metabolic health. I have no financial conflict of interest for this talk. I practice general internal medicine in San Diego, California, and Prescott, Arizona. I'm the host of Life's Best Medicine podcast and the Low Carb MD podcast. This guy should look familiar to you since he just talked to you, but this is Dr. Ben Bickman again. He taught me 5 important things for a long, healthy life. Number 1, manage our stress. Don't work 18-hour days and be stressed all the time. Get adequate sleep. 8 hours of sleep or so. Avoid smoking and alcohol, or excessive alcohol, I should say. Regular exercise and eating real food. So these are the 5 things we can do to improve our health. Everything else is luck of the draw. In other words, what he's talking about is controlling carbohydrates, prioritizing protein, don't fear fat, and fast, which is meaning time restricted eating or eating fewer times per day. In other words, stay as insulin sensitive as possible. So if you can imagine, your fat cells are like these balloons here. When we're young, they're all empty, so they could fill up really slowly. But once they start getting really full, they start ignoring insulin because they don't want to explode. So they're saying, look, I can't take any more sugar in right now, so stop forcing me to do that. So this is from Dr. Bickman's lab, and I use this with patients all the time, because standard medicine, we're missing out on the importance of metabolic health. So as you can see, this yellow line is glucose or your 3-month sugar average. And if we're just following that, we may miss impending diabetes, because it doesn't just happen one day, this type 2 diabetes. And so between these 2 lines is about 15 to 20 years of time. So during that time, you can see this green line is going up here. Hopefully you can see my pointer, and that balloon is filling up more and more and more. And once the balloon gets full, your pancreas that makes insulin will start getting fatigued. And as that drops down, sugars start going up. So this is the time of insulin resistance, and the net result of that is type 2 diabetes. So we have a lot of risk factors that we can look at in clinical medicine. One of my favorite tools is a continuous glucose monitor. This is someone on a low carbohydrate diet, so you could see during the day they're not getting these big spikes that they would get from eating, a lot of sugar with meals, and the sugars look flat like this, which means your body needs to produce less insulin to get rid of sugar. So as a clinical example, this is one of my favorite patients. He came to me October 1st. This is in 2020. A lot of stuff was going on at that time, for sure, for all of us. But October 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, you can see his sugars were well above into this white line here, with poorly controlled diabetes with a markedly elevated A1C, the 3-month sugar average, despite being on insulin. So you can take a look at this, and here he is 3 weeks later to a month later. His sugars are running 90 to 100 off all medicines. We had to stop all of his diabetes medicines down here at the bottom because he was getting low sugars, right? And this one spike here was from exercise. So not all sugar spikes on the continuous glucose monitors are bad. So anyone want to guess what this one was? You guessed it, happy hour. 1 margarita with one of my patients, and you can see that red where it went low afterwards. So when that happens, you want more food, you want to eat stuff. That's why we have chips and salsa with our margaritas, I guess. And this one was half a cupcake, right? Half a cupcake made her sugar go up to almost 200. And then she got low sugars afterwards and was hungry. But look, she got right back on track the next day and her eating was perfect. So a lot of us think that eating sushi is healthy. So here's the spike for sugar. This is the same patient, by the way, 2 weeks, 1 week apart. Sushi made this patient go to 202, and look at this. With having a steak, the sugars went down from 85 down to 73. Right. So it actually slowed. The body was using this food as fuel. This has a lot of carbohydrates because the rice, people don't realize 1 cup of rice has about 10 scoops of sugar or teaspoons of sugar in it. So there is a lot of sugar in that, plus the sauces and everything else we do. So I was struggling with weight mostly because I was having sushi and white rice, thinking I could lose weight that way. And it doesn't work if you're insulin resistant. So here's what a steak's full of. So a lot of us are confused. So your neighbors are going to tell you don't eat steak. Well, it's actually 71% water. This comes from Zoe Harcum. 71% water, 21% protein, only 7% fat, which is this little spot right here, and 2% of saturated fat. So we've been really taught to fear fat, in standard medicine, and we're starting to realize we have to change our ways. This is the nutritional value of a ribeye steak. This is from another nutritionist online. But you could see it's not just cholesterol. People think steak is just cholesterol. Look at all the nutritional value you have. I won't go through all that for you for the sake of time. And here's the other one. You can kind of imagine this is the 1 week. This is the same patient, by the way, a week apart. And look at this big spike of sugar. What's the difference? The top tracing was a double wrapped in lettuce, right? The bottom one, they just added the bun. And this is in someone who's insulin resistant. So you could see a lot of the stuff we think is healthy, like whole wheat toast and bread, it's going to really spike the sugar levels and insulin levels. Both oatmeal and cereal raise sugars like crazy, and then you get a lowering of sugar afterwards, so you get hungry all the time. This is someone who ate a bunch of eggs, and you can see that the eggs were very flat and no spike of sugars with that. So if you're going to get an omelet for breakfast, get that over pancakes and syrup. Trust me on that from a metabolic standpoint. This is what's actually in eggs. So when your friends tell you eggs are full of cholesterol, take an eye of all the nutritional value. There's no more nutritionally sound food than that. And this is important too, because a lot of us, when we go to the doctor, they're going to tell us to look at LDL cholesterol. For me, it's way down the list. I really look at the metabolic markers first. As Dr. Bickman talked about, high triglycerides, low HDL cholesterol, having a big belly, high sugars, right? And high blood pressure. So this is in the country of Colombia. They took everyone who had a heart attack and they compared them to people who didn't have a heart attack, and they looked at what markers would matter. So if the risk ratio here is 1, it means it made no difference. So they looked at total cholesterol, made no difference. LDL cholesterol made no difference. High blood pressure doubled the risk of heart attack. High insulin, almost 700% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So when we see this, we think, well, why does my doctor only throw a statin to look at my LDL cholesterol and tell me not to eat red meat? Where the big elephant in the room is this high insulin level. Most doctors don't check insulin levels. Very few do. Less than 1% of doctors that I know check it. But this is our biggest marker. If we don't fix this, we're at market risk for metabolic disease and diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Also, HDL cholesterol. We find on a low carbohydrate diet or a carnivore diet that people's HDL, so you want to be in the shortest stack here. So if your HDL is only 25, that's your risk of heart attack. If your LDL coming across here is 220. But if you just sit in the front row, if your HDL goes higher, the good cholesterol, your chance of cardiovascular disease goes way down. So even though this person in the back row here has an LDL of 100, they're at markedly increased risk of cardiovascular disease because of low HDL. This is a study that they show here. I have it referenced on the bottom from 2009. 75% of people who had a heart attack had LDL cholesterol in the normal range. So this is food for thought here. Are we looking at the wrong marker? A lot of these people with higher LDL cholesterol may have lower insulin and be metabolically healthier and less likely to have a heart attack. This is from the Women's Health Study. This was Professor Noakes went through this again, and he said, let's look at the data and subtype for all these different risk factors. Type 2 diabetes was by far the biggest risk factor. Metabolic syndrome, as we talked about, is a huge risk factor also, which is a precursor to diabetes, hypertension, obesity, smoking. So where's LDL? Way down here at the bottom, 1.38. And this is all we talk about in Western medicine. So because we have a drug for that, we could throw that drug on and make ourselves feel better. What else strongly predicts outcomes? This is a A1C. This is why we're battling diabetes. In women in particular, you can see if your A1C is at 7, you're at almost 400% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So why not lower it down to down here in this range and decrease your risk significantly? So we really have to control the sugars and the diabetes. This is one of my patients, just to give you a clinical aspect of this. Here she is on a low-fat diet when she came to me, 256 pounds. We put her on a more of a ketogenic, low-carbohydrate diet with more red meat and less grains and rice and all that stuff. And her weight came down 58 pounds in 16 weeks. Her waist came down 11 inches, which is a huge marker for cardiovascular disease. A1C 3-month sugar average dropped 2 points from 7.7 to 5.7. Her triglycerides came from 314 to 65, 249 points down. Her HDL went up 32 points. That's when we went higher. Her LDL dropped 59 points. So if low-fat diet is controlling our LDL, she's doing everything backwards here, because her LDL dropped dramatically on a higher fat diet. And her visceral fat, which is the dangerous fat around the organs, highly correlated with those balloons being full, dropped in half, 3.5 liters. So this is another point I want to make on the continuous glucose monitors that are important. Is this is my patient with type 2 diabetes on a well-managed low carbohydrate diet. Here she is on Friday. Here she is on Saturday. So her numbers, she was sitting on that red line before. Now she's up closer to that yellow line. And then here she went right over and then straight back down afterwards. If you can see her tracings from the next day, it was lower than this red line most of the day. And I asked her what she ate that day. Believe it or not, she was fasting, but she was very stressed because she had to give a talk like I'm doing now. And because of the stress of giving that talk, her sugars went straight up. Her talk started at 3 o'clock and ended at 4 o'clock. And after that, it came straight down. And we see this all the time. So don't underestimate the power of stress. And this is another patient of mine. I'm just putting this on there. This is what he typically runs. And then he went out of town. Here he is. He went to dinner that night. He had Taco Bell. And he said, it didn't even taste good. But look how long his sugar stayed up this whole time. Next day, he was visiting with family and friends, and he had chips and salsa, and it went up like this. Next day, believe it or not, he exercised. And when he exercised, his sugars went up. He was just burning off that extra sugar, and we saw it on the freeway basically going to the muscles. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a good thing. And then he had dinner and dessert. The next day, he had biscuits and gravy and an egg, and his sugar went to 256. The reason I put this here, and again, he had dinner and dessert that night. The reason I put this here for you, you can look at this. Bacon, eggs, and avocado, his sugars did nothing the next day. So if you have to choose between these two things, which one are you going to choose to keep your sugars down and your insulin low? Here we go. Like Dr. Beckman's talking about those 5 things. And then at night, he had a burger wrapped in lettuce, but then he had to have the sweet potato fries, right? But interestingly enough, even though his sugars were so high that whole time, he actually lost weight during this time because he was very low stress. He was visiting his grandson for the first time, took a week off of work. And so it's not all about what we're eating. Stress does play a role in all this stuff. And this one I wanted to leave you with, because we're short on time. This impacted me. This is a patient that I was consulted on that has severe dementia. And so he was on a standard American diet, eating a lot of sugar. He was on supplements that they give seniors that, like these milkshakes that are high sugar. And he sat like this day after day after day, just staring at the ground, drooling. Here he is, a month later, after doing a ketogenic diet and watching his carbohydrate intake, and they put him on some shakes that had very good fat content in it. So since all of us are getting older here, this is something, I don't think the sound's going to come across, but you could see him playing catch with his great-grandchildren. So the benefits of metabolic health on our seniors and all of us is dramatic, and I don't think there's anything more dramatic than seeing someone who couldn't function at all now engaging and talking with his family. So this is why working in the field of metabolic health is so exciting for us. And thank you so much. I'll let Dr. Ballerstedt take over here. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what we're doing in the clinic, and I thank you for your attention.
In summary, there is a global epidemic of chronic illnesses which have a common root, insulin resistance with chronically elevated insulin. Since diet is the primary driver, we can correctly call this a form of malnutrition. The agricultural products of grazing lands management, that is red meat and full-fat dairy, as the best sources of the essential nutrition humans require for proper development and function, are part of the solution. So my challenge, what can we do? Well, first, as individuals, we can educate ourselves, we can learn more, and apply that knowledge as necessary in our own lives. And then I'd ask the question, is there a role for the National Grazing Lands Coalition in promoting this message to its members and their communities through educational programs, perhaps member screening, appropriately advocating? We're open to suggestions, so please let us know what you think. Here's where you can begin to learn more. First, with Professor Bickman's book, Why We Get Sick, The Hidden Epidemic at the Root of Most Chronic Disease and How to Fight It. Can also recommend the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners, who offer accreditation to health professionals, as well as resources for the general public. They do also have a provider directory locator system. Dr. Lenskis is practicing in Arizona, but he's one of a growing number of metabolic health practitioners that are available. Thank you, and we look forward to answering your questions here at our poster and our vendor table in the main room. Please feel free to contact me with any questions, comments, and suggestions. How can we regenerate public health?